At the end of World War II, when the United Nations was being created, the world was coming to grips with the fact that civilization had arrived at a time and possessed a technology that for the first time in human history, we possessed the ability to kill absolutely everyone on earth and bring history itself to a halt. When even the skeptics were having to face the reality of the Holocaust with millions of casualties and atomic bomb craters with countless thousands who had simply evaporated into mushroom clouds, the United Nations drafted a universal declaration of human rights. And my thoughts were naturally drawn to this Declaration of Human Rights when I saw that our biblical reading for today was to be the Ten Commandments. Those of you who are in my Wednesday night class may recall the picture that I showed you of a stone stela of the Code of Hammurabi, a large stone monument with the ethical laws of the land in Babylon inscribed upon it. And at the top of that stela, if you'll recall, is an image of King Hammurabi receiving the law from God. This image must certainly have framed the ancient Israelite telling of how Moses went up on Mount Sinai and was given the Ten Commandments written in stone by the finger of God. The purpose of the Decalogue for the Hebrew people was to establish an ancient Israelite civilization that was both stable and just. For a people trying to survive the transition from being wandering nomads to an increasingly agrarian society that would have set boundaries and ownership of land and consistent neighbors. You know, when you're a nomad, your neighbors are always changing. But when you own a farm, your neighbors are the same. And so this whole business about not killing each other and not taking each other's stuff becomes much more important. We have tended to paste these Ten Commandments up in public school classrooms when I was a kid, currently in the circuit court clerk's office, as a way of making a kind of wordy oblation to Jewish and Christian traditions. But the real purpose of writing the Ten Commandments was to establish a nation around a religion and an emphatic set of human rights laws. You can say that the Ten Commandments were written for a community that had escaped the cruelty of slavery, and they were trying to establish a secure and peaceful nation in much the same way that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written in the modern era. Our Ten Commandments, that amounts to about 70 commandments, I guess, in an era to help us to establish a secure and peaceful world. But you don't see the Ten Commandments posted in public much anymore, but perhaps more importantly, you almost never hear any reference to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I don't want to show of hands, but I'm afraid many of you may have never even heard of it or knew that it existed. It was not especially well written. Like most committee written documents, it's not great literature, it's not pretty, it's not poetic. I don't think it can be set to music, although some people have tried. And if you listen to their attempts at setting it to music, you would probably agree with me. It cannot be set to music. Now, you can look it up online, but I printed 40 or 50 copies and left them on the table in the narthex that you can pick up on your way out today. Didn't want to put it in your hands because I'm jealous for your attention. I don't want you sitting here reading while I'm trying to talk to you. It was written, though, at a time when the world had just survived the most bloody and destructive war in human history. And the world's statesmen recognized that the root of most international conflict is injustice, that it is crimes against human rights that bring us consistently to the brink of war. The survivors of World War II wanted to create a world in which universal respect for the rights of every human being would help to secure a peaceful and just world for the future, in the same way that the Ten Commandments attempted to establish that kind of order in the ancient Hebrew society. Now, of course, a certain ominous die was cast when there were 8 nations that voted against this Declaration of Human Rights, all the Soviet bloc nations, as well as, surprise, surprise, Saudi Arabia. But the real reason is that it's not very often mentioned over the past 63 or 4 years is that we have failed to take its rather noble principles very seriously. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights forbids slavery or any form of forced labor. But slavery still abounds in the Eastern Hemisphere, and almost all the fruits of slavery are sold in the Western Hemisphere. I've often said when you go to Walmart to shop, you should hear the sounds of chains and you should see blood on the floors, because Walmart is the largest distributor of slave-produced material in the world. On the heels of the Holocaust, the Declaration insists that everyone has a right to nationhood. There can be no people who are denied citizenship. We were so determined to give nationhood to the surviving Jewish people that we took a nation away from Palestinian people, solving a European crime with Middle Eastern real estate. And even now, as Palestinians beg the United Nations to vote for recognition of their nationhood, the United States is saying, we'll veto that vote if you get that vote 60 years later, telling them, now get this, try to say this with a straight face, you Palestinians should try negotiation. I mean, it's ridiculous to say that 60 years later. Sort of take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning, okay, Israel, Palestine. I don't want to sound anti-Israeli in saying that. In fact, I must count myself among those who I was entirely seduced by the city of Jerusalem when I first visited there, its history and its architecture. I'm one of the people who loves Israel. And I want them to have peace. I want them to have security. But I cannot stand the fact that the victims of the Holocaust are exacting a pound of flesh from every generation of Palestinians. And they're doing it with our tax money, and they're doing it with our military support. I can hardly express how angry I get about the way that Israel treats Palestinians. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights also says that everyone has a right to have freedom from torture. Also hard for Americans to say with a straight face right now. It appears to be a standard viewed almost as quaint by some of the people in our own nation. It also says that everyone has a right to marry and have a family, even though the people who wrote that 63 years ago may not have considered who all wants to marry and have a family. But I think we can now say that with a clear voice, that everyone on earth has a right to marry the person they love and to have a family with that person. The most apparently redundant of the provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights goes to a series of statements about how everyone has a right to equal treatment before a court, in a court of law. Clearly, several people on this committee writing this document wanted to repeat this guarantee in so many different ways. The sentence says the same thing over and over in slightly different wording in order to make it absolutely clear that everyone, no matter what color, what religion, what culture, what language, what age, or what economic class, could stand before a judge with absolute impartiality, a presumption of innocence until proven guilty, and no favoritism to be shown for any reason. There are a number of things in America about which I have become rather cynical in the last few years. I've been disappointed by the way in which democracy has expressed itself. But I can tell you there's nothing that's broken my heart as much as seeing the seamy underbelly of our court system and the penal system that serves the court's bidding. Favoritism is not only shown to corporations and the wealthy, but it has become unavoidably obvious to me that our justice system is managed by a good old boy system who run the courts almost as if it was their personal vineyard and a private playground. I had one proud moment finally representing myself in a case in court when I stood before a judge and quoted Howard Zinn, who said that our justice system does not seek to find what is right and what is wrong. It serves only to determine who can pay their lawyer the longest. With few exceptions, only the wealthy in America can afford to either seek justice or to defend themselves against injustice in our judiciary. And if there is corporate favoritism in the American justice system, I shudder to think what it must be like to stand trial in Mexico or Poland or Saudi Arabia or Russia or China. We have just witnessed the eventual release of 2 American hikers who have spent nearly 2 years in prison in Iran on trumped-up charges, and they were only released on the strength of what amounts to a $1 million bribe. And even when the whole health insurance industry was in its infancy, the writers of the Declaration of Human Rights said, and I'll quote this exactly, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his own control." Amazing, isn't it, when you just sit down and think about how should the world be run? It's obvious that sick people should have access to health care, and old people should have access to retirement, and widows and orphans should be able to live with dignity. The profit motives seemed to be very small at the end of World War II, and human rights seemed to be very large. But in the decades since, since we nearly blew ourselves up, corporations have become people, and people have become expendable. The Ten Commandments represented an ancient faith community's attempt at establishing peace, security, stability, and human rights for everyone. I'm certain that the ancient Hebrews largely failed in their application of these principles, but they knew in their hearts that they needed to try. In the modern era, we've attempted in America to write a Bill of Rights, a Constitution. Even in our church, we have these 8 points that we print every week that we say is our declaration of what kind of freedom of thought and religion that we want to have, of progressive faith. And internationally, we have composed this universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it's all just so much talk. If we will not work, if we will not sacrifice, if we do not have the courage to testify, to demand, sometimes to provoke, sometimes even to threaten our own society to pay attention to human rights. Torture is just wrong. It should never happen. We should stop even acting like there's a debate. Torture's wrong. Nations have a right to exist. They have a right to exist. They shouldn't have to negotiate for that. They have a right to exist. The judiciary should be held to a sacred standard of impartiality and justice and equality. And where we can demonstrate that that's not true, judges should be removed, law licenses should be revoked, and a demand that just covers the globe should be made that the judiciary should operate with equality. And people who love one another and want to pledge themselves to become a family shouldn't have to ask the government in any nation or any state for permission to be a family. The Ten Commandments were written to inspire faithfulness, peace, and security among an increasingly settled population of former nomads. In our day, we have to respond realistically, ethically, and responsibly to our situation and our challenges. We can now destroy virtually all life on this planet, either through warfare or through careless pollution. And we have a moral responsibility to make certain that neither one of those things ever happens. And even though we have gleefully escaped the tyranny of mind and heart imposed upon us by neurotic organized religion, we have an even more important obligation to our faith in a God who is the author of justice and of mercy, to make certain that justice rolls down like rivers and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Let the people of God say amen.
Amen.